Today's virtual event is in celebration of World Space Week, which was declared by the General Assembly to run from October 4th to the 10th, to celebrate each year at the international level the contributions of space science and technology to the betterment of the human condition. This year's theme is Women in Space, and that's why we've put together this incredible lineup of speakers. A huge thank you to our sponsor today, Lockheed Martin Australia, for their support. This is going to be a really exciting session, and it's also the first in a series of virtual events that we will be running for our ASITII, which stands for Australian Space Industry, Technology, Infrastructure and Investment Festival of Space. We can share more on that later. Also be sure to check out our Space and Defence channel, spaceanddefence.io. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our moderator for today's session, Suman Rai. Sumen is the director of the Defence Innovation Partnership, which is a collaborative initiative of the South Australian Government, Defence Science and Technology Group, and the 3 South Australian universities. So welcome, Sumen. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jess. I invite all the other panelists to join us on the screen as we start the session. Thank you for the invitation to moderate this really important session today. And also thank you to all the women who've joined us and agreed to be on the panel. We have an incredible sort of wealth of knowledge and experience here, and I'm really keen to unpack some of your experiences and insights. So joining us today, we have Dr. Alice Gorman, who's a space archaeologist and an author, and joining us from Flinders University. Julia Mitchell, who is a senior spacecraft systems engineer from Sitael, Australia. Julia Dickinson, who is a chief engineer, military satellite communications at Lockheed Martin, Australia. Dr. Amy Parker, who is the satellite operations and data manager at CSIRO. And then, of course, you've got me. I am Suman Rai, the director of the Defence Innovation Partnership. So as Jess mentioned, it is World Space Week, which is a UN initiative. And there'll be many panels like this happening all over the world, which is really nice to think about. But it's been declared this year that the theme for World Space Week is Women in Space. And that's in recognition that even now, women are an underrepresented group all over the world in the space sector. In fact, just yesterday, the UN released some figures which shows that women make up around 20% of the global workforce in space, and that proportion hasn't changed in the last 30 years. So we'll be having a few discussions about the experiences that our panelists have gone through to get to where they are today. And especially for the younger people in the audience, I hope you'll be able to take some insight and inspiration from what we'll be talking about today. So I'd like to get started, and in order to, as a way of introduction, I suppose, for all of our panelists, I'd really like to hear a little bit about who you are, what your current role is in your organization, and also what either inspired you to get into the space sector or how you found yourself ending up there. So how about we start with Alice to begin with?
Thank you, Suman, and I'm talking to everyone today from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. So I'm a space archaeologist. I work at Flinders University, but I'm also involved in the broader space community as the vice chair of the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities, and on the Council of the Space Industry Association of Australia, and I'm also on the Council of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Adelaide chapter. And when I think about that, for an archaeologist, that seems to be quite a deep involvement in space. My research is about the archaeology and cultural heritage of the stuff that humans have put all throughout the solar system. And my current major research project is the archaeology of the International Space Station, which I'm doing with my colleague Justin Walsh from Chapman University in the US. And my pathway into space as an archaeologist really started from looking up in the night to the night sky, looking at all of the stars and galaxies, and just basically wondering what that was all about and how humans came to be. So that's kind of the same question from an archaeological perspective and from an astronomical perspective. I became a professional archaeologist, but wandered into the space community when I was, a completely grown-up person with a whole career in heritage management. And again, looking up at the night sky, I realized that Earth is surrounded by orbital debris, and that was an archaeological record. So this led me to move from being a professional archaeologist to working on space archaeology. And a key part of that was actually the wonderful welcome I received from the Australian space community, who maybe initially were like, who is this weird archaeologist who keeps coming to things and won't go away, but basically embraced me and my ideas. And that's kind of, I guess, how I got to where I am now.
Fantastic, thank you, Alice. Hopefully we'll be able to have a bit more of a discussion about your path and your research a little bit later on in the session. I'd like to invite Julia Dickinson, please, to address us.
Sorry, problems with the mute button there. Yeah, so I was inspired, I guess, to get into space because during my childhood, the space shuttle program was underway. And so that was something that was new from the since Apollo, and really got my attention. I found a scrapbook. My parents lumped a big box of my stuff from when they were cleaning out the house recently, and it was a huge scrapbook of every newspaper cutting from the space shuttle program, and all the cutouts on Sally Ride and the 7 first women astronauts. So that really got my attention, I think. My career's mainly been in satellite communications, and I'm currently working at Lockheed Martin, Australia, on military satellite communications, and on a bid for the JP9102 project, which is a huge Australian government project to put a satellite communication system in place for our military communication. So it's a very exciting project. Before that, when I started off by answering an ad for a graduate spacecraft engineer at ASITII, which was launching the first communication satellites for Australia. Then that became Optus. I worked in operations of the satellites and procurement of new satellites, involved in the build and test and launching of those satellites. Moved to World Space, which was operating a satellite out of Australia from Melbourne at South Bank, which most people wouldn't know. It was a US company. I completed my MBA in this after starting with an engineering degree. Failed to mention that, and then I got a job with NBN on the SkyMuster program. So the 2 SkyMuster satellites that are used for the NBN broadband system. They were 2 of my babies, and so I worked on that for quite a while. And I've been joined Lockheed Martin Australia this year. It's really exciting time to be in the space industry, I must say.
Thank you, Julia. What an incredible sort of breadth of experience across both commercial and military sort of elements of space. Julia Mitchell is next on my screen.
Thank you, Suman. Hi, I'm Julia Mitchell. I'm currently a senior spacecraft systems engineer with Sitael Australia, and I'm also a director of the Space Industry Association of Australia. With those 2 roles, the Space Industry Association is a voluntary role. We're basically just trying to grow the Australian space sector by being on the board as a director, helping with the governance of the organisation. And we brought on a CEO last year, and I think we're definitely having an impact at this point, but hopefully we'll really be able to help with those additional 20,000 jobs and help grow industry. My day job is working on satellites from typically 50 to 350 kilos with Sitael. However, I'm also working on the Buccaneer Main Mission project for Defence Science and Technology Group, which is working on a 6-unit CubeSat with Innovore Technologies. So I'm working on anything from about 3 kilos through to 350 actually. And those satellites do a variety of different things. So they can be taking images of Earth, One of them is doing X-ray astronomy and communications, infrared payloads to detect bushfires, all kinds of things. Small satellites these days are really quite exciting with what they can do. So I'm a Tasmanian. I was there for the first 17 years of my life and then have moved multiple places since, and finally settled here in Adelaide. And I have an aerospace engineering and physics degree, and also a Master of Science from Cranfield University in the UK. And yeah, I look forward to participating further.
Thank you, Julia. We love having you in Adelaide. And finally, Dr. Amy Parker.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. So I suppose I also had a somewhat sideways path into the space industry. I've actually always been fascinated by the Earth, and particularly by natural disasters on the Earth's surface. And I actually studied geophysics. And then did my PhD in volcanology. But what better way to study the Earth than being able to see it from space? And that's how I really fell into the field of Earth observation. So I'm currently based at CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, where I suppose I'm an up and downstream Earth observation specialist. So that means that I'm involved in the operation of satellites and the mechanics of actually getting that data to users, but then also in applying that data to understand changes on the Earth's surface. And my particular expertise has been in a special type of data called synthetic aperture radar. And in 2017, Australia actually invested in a capacity share of an Earth observation satellite called Novasar, which collects this space radar data. And I've been operating that as Australia's first kind of sovereign civilian Earth observation satellite capability. And we're making all of that data free and open access to users. So I'm also currently acting as the director of our Centre for Earth Observation at CSIRO. And then I'm vice president of Earth Observation Australia, which is a really great cross-sector organisation for Earth observation professionals that really champions the need for Earth observation, links across government into policy, and provides lots of training and webinar type materials. So anyone who's interested, I would recommend that you take a look on the internet for Earth Observation Australia. Thanks so much, Amy. What I'd like to do now is move into sort of the bulk of the questions for the session. For some of them, I will throw to a particular panelist to kick off the discussion, but I absolutely welcome the other panelists joining in to make this more of a conversation rather than a question and answer session. So please do so if you feel like you have something to say. So to begin with, I'd like to start with Julia D. And this is really sort of off the back of the experience that you've described in your own career across both the commercial and the military communications space. So in your view, you know, sort of seeing that the opportunities and the activities across civil, commercial and military space are increasing and the activity is increasing, where do you see that the opportunities might be, you know, both now and in the future for people becoming involved in the space sector? Sorry, Julia, you're on mute.
Had the button poised this time. Yeah, the great question. I think there's a lot more opportunities now, and I think they're all connected. The industry used to be very fragmented before we had the space agency. Now that there's Space 2.0 and a lot more of the contracts are going to commercial organisations, we're keeping people in Australia. It used to be people going overseas, all our talent was going overseas, like Julia Mitchell, for example, was one person we lost, but we got her back, yay. So that's a really good opportunity for people to have jobs in Australia. There's a huge groundswell of people building up, and now this space agency is connecting, I think, everybody. And just by the example of all the projects that Julia mentioned, there's a lot of new startups happening. There's a lot of smaller organisations that are able to get off the ground. A lot more women are starting up. You know, women are starting up those companies as well. On the so that, you know, there's more startups, more talent staying here. In the defence space, the Australian government is really pushing Australian industry content and capabilities. So that's a really big boon for the Australian space industry, because that will encourage lots of smaller and medium-sized enterprises and larger companies to be able to do the work in Australia rather than the work going overseas. So I think that's the main benefits. And space benefits science and technology in general, because there are so many facets to it. It's not just about rocks in space. It's about humanity as well. It's about, you know, looking down back at Earth. And so it benefits, you know, there's lots of other benefits, which I won't go on about here, but right now, I'm sure it'll come up in the panels. But yeah, I think it'll be a widespread impact across all science and technology. And hopefully our governments will then see there's more value in putting more money into science and technology because of the benefits that come directly from space.
Great, thanks, Julia. Amy, I might throw to you if that's okay. Working in CSIRO and seeing sort of, particularly in the Earth observation area, are you seeing that there's increasing opportunities in how people are both applying sort of Earth observation technologies and also using the data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things is that to some degree, the barriers to entry for using this type of data can actually still be quite high. You know, to come at it with no training and just it being something that you want to use in your work can be quite challenging. And Australia has really been pioneering methods to actually overcome some of these challenges and make it easier to access and kind of reach back into the archives of data and look at, you know, a 20-year time series on a continental scale. And that's done through something that we call the Open Data Cube. And so that's now become really a global initiative, you know, that's picked up through NASA, all sorts of organizations, and they're really building on this to break down those barriers to entry and enable more people to use this type of data, because it has so many values from, you know, agriculture, resource extraction, monitoring environments, monitoring infrastructure. Kind of the possibilities are endless, but it's just sometimes being able to use it can be a little tricky.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'll, if I can, make a comment on that. Just over the weekend, there was a global hackathon called the NASA Space Apps Challenge. And I've been involved with this sort of event for about, I guess, the last 10 years since it began. And really the number of people who are able to participate and actually utilize some of this open data that's available through NASA and other agencies seems to be increasing, which is really great to see as some of these techniques and sort of data analysis becomes integrated into our education systems a little bit more and a little bit earlier, I suppose. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, Amy. So related to that, I'd like to sort of speak to Alice for a moment. So usually when we look at space, or we talk about space sector and we talk about opportunities, often we are sort of almost automatically thinking about the STEM disciplines. So for those who might not know, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it's become quite a prevalent phrase that's used these days. But I'd also like to unpack, I suppose a lot of your work, you know, sort of integrates elements of STEM disciplines, but also of humanities, arts, and social sciences. And this is an acronym I suppose people might not be as well aware of, which is HASS. So I really would like to, I suppose, unpack a little bit of that, Alice. Knowing that it still might be a little bit difficult for people to understand the role of the humanities, arts, and social sciences in conjunction with STEM in the space sector, could you please tell us a little bit about how you see HASS playing a really critical role in the way that we develop our space sector?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is, while people do tend to think of space as being all about technology and science, no technology is value neutral. Technologies are created by people, used by people, and have impacts on people. And it's understanding all of those complicated social factors that makes the HASS disciplines incredibly relevant for the space sector. So this means people in those areas are doing a whole bunch of things. So we can look at people who are working on policy and law, for example. Space ethics is a very important area that I think is becoming more and more important, and space ethicists are frequently philosophers, so you probably can't get more hats than philosophy, but this is, you know, absolutely critical as technologies are changing so fast, and we don't know, you know, what are the implications of a lot of these things that we're seeing happen. HAS disciplines also typically critique social movements and politics and ideas. And I think this is also a really vital role. So this means people who can look at something that's happening and say, well, the problems with this are around these particular ideas that we need to be mindful of, that we need to think of. I mean, for example, if people are going to modify the human body in order to survive on other planets, what does that mean? This is where people who think about these things in the HAS disciplines become really important. And as a very quick example, my own research on the International Space Station is using social science and archaeology techniques to find out stuff about how people live in space that no one at NASA knows, because they've never done any archaeology before. So we're literally finding out new things about how people adapt to that environment. I can tell you more about them another time, or you can read about them. But this is stuff that helps us do space better. I suppose at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We want space to be something that makes human lives better. And we can't do that without the full panoply of perspectives, which includes the HAS disciplines.
Great, thanks, Alice. Just to ask if any of the other panelists who do come from engineering and sort of science backgrounds might have any experience working alongside colleagues who come from a HAS discipline.
Not really directly in work, which I think is an issue. I mean, I agree with Alice. It's absolutely important that what we do is seen as the whole package for everybody. It's not just you know, mad scientists, us mad scientists and engineers going off doing our thing. That we look at it from the whole of humanity perspective. So.
Mm. Yes, sorry, Amy, you were about to say something.
I think, yeah, definitely in terms of kind of understanding the social license to operate, and in being able to take the findings that we get from space data. So particularly if they're around things, for example, like risk. So if you have an event that's going to result in populations being needed to evacuate, then how do you actually go about you know, integrating those needs into the society there? So I think that sometimes in making some of the findings into, you know, reality, that really relies upon the HAS disciplines. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think the really exciting thing for me is that this opens up even more opportunities for our growing space sector, is when we include not only the STEM disciplines, but also people who might be interested in studying HAS at school, for example, that there is a place for them in our sector. But kind of drawing upon that, Julia M., I'm going to come to you. You've mentioned that you're one of the directors of the the Space Industry Association of Australia. And I guess in your combined experience working in one of our, you know, sort of local organizations that's working in the space sector, and also being able to see you know, a wide range of other organizations, industry, and also universities, research organizations, and so on, in your role with the SIAA. What personally for you are some of the highlights and the real good news stories that you're seeing come out of the space industry currently?
Oh, that's a good question. I think personally for me, the best experience for me was being able to find a job back in Australia. So I know Julia D alluded to it before, but a few years ago, essentially the company I was working for went bankrupt. It's actually quite common for people to work in the space industry to have at least one redundancy. I've had 2, my boss has had 2. So it happens, space companies rise and fall, and it's quite common globally as well. But yeah, I was able to find a job back in Australia. I lived in the US for nearly 2 years, and while Trump was in, and it just wasn't kind of my place. Great experience. I got to see the build of a 1.5 ton satellite SES-16 or GovSat-1, which is now operating successfully in orbit for SES. But yeah, being able to come back to a job which was I worked on the satellite-based augmentation system testbed, so looking at how users can integrate more accurate GPS data into all kinds of daily activities across Australia and New Zealand. Being able to find that job and get the understanding of users and how space data is actually used and can be used was, I think it's going to be a critical thing for me throughout my career. At the moment, I think what's really exciting, but also a bit confusing, is there are a huge number of startups in Australia. You know, a couple of years ago, I know we had probably in the orders of hundreds, and what's confusing about it is that it seems that most of them are still existing, because typically many startups say they will start, and then, you know, you kind of have an 80% failure rate. I haven't witnessed that in Australia as yet. What I have witnessed is a lot of companies, startups, etc., kind of starting up with an initial idea, pivoting and then pivoting and pivoting until they kind of find their spot. And I don't know if that's actually unique in Australia or not, but there's quite a few companies really trying to do some really exciting things. I think Space Machines Co. And what they're trying to do with their tug that they're building in Sydney is pretty exciting. You know, they want to build a satellite tug and launch one next year. I think Fleet and Myriota with their different solutions for industrial IoT are pretty cool. And obviously each company is doing things their way. And I think that's really cool to see as well, that there are multiple ways to solve problems using space as space as part of the solution. But yeah, I think there are so many larger companies now also getting involved in space. You know, we've got Microsoft space people here in Australia now. We've got Amazon's here working on space. And you know, I think even the players like Sitael Australia coming across, we came across in 2018. We're an Italy headquartered company, and we're building satellites out of Italy, which will start launching next year. We have one in orbit now, but you know, we saw that there was potential here in the market in the future. So to have companies like coming across that can use space heritage and help build up the industry and work with multiple Australian players, I think is just, yeah, a really exciting part of it. And hopefully all the big defence work that's coming through that obviously Julia D's working on can actually all happen in relatively soon timeframes as well, because that'll just help really grow the industry and also engage hopefully a wide range of SMEs and keep a lot of people in space employment, which will be really exciting.
Yeah, I agree with everything Julia said, and also add what's exciting for me personally, being in the industry for a while in Australia, is it seems to be more women involved. You know, there's a lot more women in this, like Fleet is led by a woman. You know, in my company, there's 25% in Lockheed Martin Australia in space, there are 25% are women, and globally as well in the company. And it seems to me like I started off as the only woman in the room, you know, many years ago, and now I'm surrounded by them, and it's almost a critical mass where you feel like it's normal. And for me, I'm like a pig in mud. It's just really amazing. And for younger women coming in, it may not be as good. It may be, well, we're all the women. There's only 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. You know. You know, and I think the quotes, the numbers that Suman said at the beginning was 20% overall in the industry. So, you know, it will be a different experience for them, but for me, the base where I started, it is very exciting that I'm just feeling so much more comfortable in the industry now, and I just feel so much more normal, which is just wonderful.
That's great to hear, and a really nice segue into the next question that I had. So we often see, again, that when we have programs about diversity and inclusion of women in the space sector, for example, we often look at the start, I guess, or the source, you know, which is how do we attract girls and women into the industry or into research or whatever it might be. But then there is this concept of the leaky pipeline, which is as the further up you go in an organization and the more senior levels that you get to, the fewer women will be represented in those areas, or currently are represented in those areas. So this is the question for everyone, really. So I'm just looking for someone to jump in and say what they have to say. But I'm curious, especially for the younger sort of people who are listening on this session today. What do you think we need to do as a sector, as an industry, to not only attract more women and girls into the sector, but also to retain them, and especially to get them into positions of leadership? Who wants it?
Can I start?
Sure.
I have lots of thoughts about this, so I'll try and make it snappy. So I think the retention is a really critical thing. So the first thing is, I think we have a lot of male colleagues in the space sector who are very well intentioned and very well meaning and absolutely support the idea of more women being in space, no doubt about it. But they're not very well educated on what the issues are. And I think they need to go and, I'll just say it, they need to go and read a few feminist books and actually understand what the patriarchy is, what privilege is, what all of that stuff is. Because it's no good talking the talk, they have to actually change their practice. So I invite all the men in the audience to consider doing this, because I think it's really important. Something we see a lot, it's not just in the space sector, but it's across the board. Women who are having families or come back from being on maternity leave, who are managed out of their jobs. The job descriptions are changed, the job is given to someone else, all kinds of things that mean they get back to work and they are given a part-time, sometimes that suits them, fine. But a lesser role, a role that wasn't what they were set out for, a role with no prospect of a career path. This is so common and it needs to stop. So we need people to start seeing the systemic factors that make this happen and the individual factors. Something else that happens a lot too is, and sometimes in those situations, is junior men being promoted over experienced and senior women for the same job. Some of that's systemic, some of that comes down to individual circumstances, but companies need to be aware of this. They need to be aware that there are deep-seated misogynist factors in the perceptions about people that will lead to this kind of thing happening. So that happens to you and all of us on this panel, I'm sure know women this has happened to, then you're gone. You're going to leave the sector because the hard work you did was not rewarded. Equal pay, I don't need to mention. Salary visibility is a key factor in this and has been shown to work. So these are all, I could go on, I won't, but these are all things I think that we need organisations to think about long and hard and make sure don't happen so that we can retain these incredibly talented women and move beyond that 20%.
Alice, I'm just going to jump in. I think one thing that's I've become very aware of kind of in the last couple of years, as you see with universities, they've lost a lot of staff over the last couple of years, and typically many people there are on casual contracts. So if you have women that are coming in and out of the sector, why would you stay in the sector if you're on a casual job and you want to be going on parental leave? Like, you've got no, there's no stability or flexibility necessarily when you come back. I think that's one thing the research sector, I mean, it's a much wider problem generally, I think, with the casual employment in universities, but if that can start to be changed to some degree, I think that can definitely help with some of the women in space working on the research aspects for sure.
Completely agree, Julia.
Yeah, I'm the same as Alice. I could go on with this topic forever, but I'll try and be brief. Because on a couple of things you said, you know, people needing to understand what women want and what they expect. To that, we're organising, we've got an early careers council in the company where we look at female participation in early career pathways and getting them involved. We're facilitating a roundtable with universities to around Australia to understand what those organisations see as being needed to support women studying in the technical fields, and talk to the women as, you know, not just the administrators, and so they can tell us what companies like Lockheed and the other larger companies can do to support them. I think that's really important. In terms of I think you can't be what you can't see. That's an old expression. And in Lockheed Martin global space business, this is one of the reasons I'm such a happy little pig right now, is that 5 of the 5 space lines of business have their VP, their head of that business is a woman. It was 4 until recently, and someone just told me it's become 5. And I find that, you know, amazing and wonderful. So I can see that now. And so, and as far as leadership roles, I think, and we've got a large number of women in leadership roles in Lockheed Martin space in general, which is really good. So it is changing in my view, but there's a lot more that can be done. And that flexibility and where you're talking about maternity leave, Alice, I think my view on things is if men don't want it, women aren't going to get it. In this world right now. So a lot of companies, larger companies, are introducing parental leave for, you know, when people have children, the men can take off time if they're the prime carer, which is really good for the family. And if men start doing that and leaving for large chunks of time, then there's more of an opportunity that it'll be seen as something that's normal, and it's not just a woman's problem that women go off and you know, they have to deal with it for men as well. So I think that's a really good change that's happening in some companies, and I applaud that one. Sorry, I told you I could go on.
Oh, that's terrific.
Go on more, but
We could probably take it for hours. Thanks very much for your thoughts. I'd like to draw on something that you said, Julia D, about, you know, you can't be what you can't see, and that takes me to the concept of mentoring, sponsors, and role models. You know, they all play slightly different roles, I think, in encouraging people to either enter a sector or, you know, to be kind of to be able to dream, I guess, about what their future might look like. So again, this is a question for anyone who kind of wants to jump in, but I'd like to hear a little bit about you know, people in your own lives. Look, it might be women or men, but it'd be great to hear if there are women who you either have been inspired by, either someone you know or, you know, someone in the wider community, women who might have sponsored you or been mentors to you to allow you to get to where you are today in your positions of leadership.
I can go ahead on that one and say that all of those things, I think, have been wrapped into the women that I work with. I don't know whether they realize that they are mentoring me, but indirectly, I was very surprised to, I guess, join the sector and see that the head of the space agency was a woman. Some of the kind of the frequent speakers that we come across from the space agency are women, that the head of our space program was a woman, that the head of our future science platform was a woman. And I think having that kind of pipeline right the way to the top of these women who've navigated all of the, you know, the things that we know are challenges to women, and all of the things that we probably don't even realize are challenges to women in their everyday work, but seeing them having overcome that, and the fact that they're actually very personable people as well, and very approachable, and you can sort of talk about all the issues as well as the science. I think that has really been fundamental in my kind of path to where I am right now.
Could I jump in now? And I think, Suman, a distinction you've made, which is really important, is that difference between having role models and mentors and sponsors. The difference with sponsors being somebody who goes out and advocates for you, who doesn't just chat to you when you need to chat. I shouldn't say it like that, because that's really, really important to have that level of support, but a sponsor who actually will put themselves on the line for you and be out there talking about your work and promoting you and trying to get opportunities for you. And I had someone very important at the beginning of my journey in the space industry. Was actually a bloke, Brett Biddington, who many of you might know. So I was like nothing and nobody, and just hanging around these conferences banging on about space heritage. And he thought this was a valuable idea and kind of took me under his wing. And I'm convinced that this really did sort of open doors and lead to people thinking, you know, I had some credibility because he was on my side. So I think his role was kind of as a sponsor for me, being out there and supporting my work vocally and publicly. And the other person I wanted to mention, she was here on the webinar, but I can't see her now, is Beth Laura O'Leary, who kind of started the field of space archaeology all the way back in 1999. And just having somebody who was on the same wavelength, who was completely supportive of your ideas and was there to be encouraging and supportive and all of those nice things was a critical factor in continuing down this path, I guess. Feeling part of it was a tiny community. Space archaeology is still a tiny community, but just feeling part of a community is so important.
I'm going to very quickly jump in and also say that Brett was instrumental with me getting a job in the space industry here in Australia. I met him back at Naples at IAC 2016. No, sorry, 2012. And he introduced me to David Ball, who is Julia D's boss now. Yeah, and I got a job with NewSat with David. And yeah, just to have that first, once you've got that first space role, you've really got some, you know, you really start to learn and then meet all the different people. So it's really just that initial step that can really, really help. And yeah, if I hadn't had Brett at that point, I don't know quite where I'd be today.
Yeah, I didn't have any particular one individual that I would call as my sponsor or mentor, but I think there was a few, 2 or 3 men generally in the space business that supported me. And then having those conversations, I think that Alice mentioned, or someone mentioned there with Amy did, with other women in your business, that you support each other. I think women supporting women is really important as well, to boost each other up, because especially if you're one of a few, you really need to stand together, and I think that's really important. So I think that's been very important in my career, whether they be engineers or not, but just all around you.
I think I think we've kind of teased out a really interesting point, which is it's the people who are currently in those positions of power who can act as sponsors. And if they are men, I mean, we're not saying we don't want men to be our sponsors, right? Because they're the ones who allow you access to those systems and advocate for you to their peers and so on. But I think the other thing that was really important that Julia D, you mentioned was about the community. So I think that's kind of, you know, that peer mentoring as well that happens between groups of people in a sector or in an organization. And certainly for me, in this sector and in the defense sector, it's been incredibly important to have that community around me, as well as those sponsors who are willing to advocate for me, as you talked about, Alice. Great, thank you very much for that. I think that's incredibly insightful, and thank you for your stories as well. So the next question is for Amy. And again, it kind of harkens back to some comments that we made earlier about, you know, sort of looking into the future opportunities and so on. You work alongside, you know, researchers and your people doing sort of cutting edge work. And I'm keen to kind of understand what do you think the space sector in Australia not just in terms of the technological side of things, but also knowing that we're increasing, or we've got efforts to increase diversity and inclusion in the space sector. What do you think the space sector is going to look like in 50 years from now? The Australian space sector, shall I say?
The impossible question.
Yes.
I think even, you know, in the last 5 years, we've seen just that we've reached, I suppose, almost an inflection point in our growth, or maybe we're now just past this inflection point and we're on the up. With factors like the establishment of the Australian Space Agency, you know, we're at sort of the foot of this extreme, we hope to be extreme growth. And in 50 years, I suppose the end point of what that leads to and our achievements is probably beyond even what we can envisage today. I think from the technology point of view, we'll really see the industry leveraging our natural advantages and strengths, and also the unique challenges that face us as a country, to become, you know, a much more significant, notable name in the international space ecosystem. So whether that's, you know, on the human side of things, developing deep space habitats, or whether it's using our remote operations expertise that, you know, we've developed through our decades in the mining sector to mine planetary bodies instead of Earth, or launching satellites that are built in Australia by Australian companies that, you know, decide where to collect their data autonomously, and they process the data on board the spacecraft. So whether, you know, it's any of those things, I see as becoming a much more significant player rather than sort of the minor player that we currently are. And then what should we aim for later? Shall we say 50-50 gender representation in the workforce? We'll see. I think there are, you know, things that would go beyond the space sector into all other sectors around whether that is likely or to be achieved. But I think, you know, we are seeing that pipeline of talent with women being in place now, and I think what we do in our generation will benefit the next generation of workers as well. And then coming from the perspective of Earth observation, which is of course is my favorite thing, today we currently rely almost entirely on foreign satellite providers to provide our data. But we have, you know, these unique challenges that I've mentioned before. So we're the driest inhabited continent on Earth. And it sort of means that all of those products that are around from foreign providers don't quite fit our needs. And we're really taking the first steps towards overcoming that, and building kind of sovereign, tailor-made Earth observation satellite capabilities with something that we call Aquawatch Australia. And that's a partnership between CSIRO, the SmartSat Cooperative Research Centre, but then also industry, research and government. And the concept is that we have, you know, many sensors on the ground that are integrated with IoT technology. They communicate to custom-built satellites in the sky, and we become world leaders in the management of water resources. And it's really those kind of big ideas and big societal needs that I think bring together lots of different elements of the space industry, and provide lots of, you know, opportunity for us to collaborate and work together and really build this international reputation.
I love that vision of the future, and I think it also speaks to growing opportunities in areas that haven't existed before, which is what to me is so exciting about the space sector in Australia. Does anyone else want to add anything to that before we move to the next question? All right. So we've had a few questions on the Q&A that have come in from our audience. So I just want to draw one of them out. And this is particularly for people who have had experience in the space sector overseas. So the question is, how does Australia compare when considering other countries, for example, the US, for women in space? And how can we increase our relative attractiveness and promote Australia as a destination for a great space career? I've got
a relatively quick and easy answer for that one. So when I went to work in the US, I was working for a woman, and we had a team of 4, so we were 50-50 male-female, which was awesome. And the program manager for the satellite that was getting built was a woman. there weren't that many women around, but I believe in Australia we've got about 16% women in STEM in space careers here. And I think there are definitely a few more overseas, but it's still not great. But what I find here in Australia that's particularly exciting is kind of, I think, the inclusiveness and the networking that we have here. So when I was in the US, just trying to meet people and talk to other people within space, people really weren't open to it, because space had just been a career option you could have had for the last 50 years. Whereas I think in Australia, people are so enthusiastic and excited here that they just really want to get into it, and they want to meet other people who feel the same way. So I think the community is something here, which is very different. I think there is a lot of impetus here in Australia as well to try and increase women participation amongst STEM generally. So I can only hope that that really helps push space.
Yeah, I can jump into my experience in the US, because I spent about 5 years there overall, is that there are a lot more women in the space industry there, and it's much more seemed to be normal. We get a lot more ribbing here, if you like, and it seems more accepted there. But I think it's changed, as I said, it's changing here in a positive way in some companies, you know. But yeah, I think it is definitely more accepted in places like the US, with women in space. But I agree with Julia said, that what Julia said on the excitement side of, and the people wanting to be part of a community here. It's also, it's not new. People have been around trying to get into the industry and develop the industry for a long time, but the impetus with the Australian Space Agency and the commercialisation of it, I think, has really brought that community feel in Australia now.
Sorry there. We seem to have lost Alice, but we'll keep going. All right, so there was another question. So what role do you think vocational education and educational pathways play in getting more women into STEM and space industries, whether that is as a first, second, or third career? So I guess this is really about the various pathways that might exist to get more women into space.
I think it's pretty interesting that you can not actually set about studying space and end up in the space sector. I think one of the things that we are really trying to do in my organisation is think more smartly about the things that we're doing that could have secondary applications to space. So there are things that people are working on in a terrestrial context that actually have that dual application. So you don't have to necessarily do a physics degree or an engineering degree and then be an astrophysicist or an space engineer to be in the space sector. There are actually, I'd say, lots of diverse pathways, and you know, increasingly things like manufacturing are going to play an important role in the Australian space sector as well. So I think probably more diverse than we realise.
And I think I would add to that as well, that, you know, what we were talking about earlier about other disciplines, so not just the STEM disciplines. As the sector grows, as you talked about, Amy, in, you know, 50 years from now, we want to be world leaders in the space sector. We're going to need to build side by side those elements that Alice talked about earlier, in terms of the legal, you know, the ethical, and all of those other sort of disciplines that, you know, maybe people don't automatically think about. So this, I'm hoping this kind of answers another one of the questions that we had, which talks about whether there's a path to working in space that doesn't involve a STEM degree, and what other types of roles there are. So I think the answer to that is yes. And it's just going to grow as more organizations and more activity happens in the space sector. Did anyone want to add to that comment?
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I met someone in Melbourne who was developing spacesuits, and that led to materials for people with bad circulation. You know, so medical side of things. You know, as people go back to the moon and to Mars and look at habitats, and there'll be things to do with you know, crops and agriculture. So the whole gamut of life, you know, is gets caught up in the space industry. You know, so I don't think it's just directly STEM or directly engineers and scientists. There's medicine is a STEM, but you know, there's so much more. You know, there's a lot of industry. You know, a lot of sideways paths you can get in, still be in the industry, which I think is one of the reasons it's so exciting an industry to be in, because it's not just, you know, rocks and sorry, I'm not disparaging rocks. I've got a big rock behind me, a big asteroid behind me. So you know, it's not something that's just, you know, it does encompass all of humanity's kind of experiences, I think.
So we have a comment from one of our attendees which says industry engagement and project management. And then someone else has just come in with other options: finance, law, communications, sourcing, so many. And I think that goes to your point, Julia D, which is really, it's a sector that will involve all of the roles that you would see in any other sector, but obviously with the very specific challenges that you're facing in the space environment, right? Which will be really interesting to see how those fields develop.
Can I leap in? Oh, sorry, with the famous story from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy about the Golgafrinchans, who got rid of all of their useless professions and sent them off to another planet, including the telephone sanitizers. And then everybody on the original planet of Golgafrincham died from a disease caught from dirty telephones. So I think that's a great example of how you can't rule any area of expertise or any profession out of space, because we need all of them.
Fantastic. Big fan of the B arc. All right. So we're getting close to the end of the session today. So I think I'd like to close off with perhaps more of a personal question for you all. Looking back at your careers and where you've ended up in your career now, what would you tell your 11-year-old self? And what would you say to your 11-year-old self, knowing where you are now? Anyone?
I'd say don't try and predict the future too much and plan too far ahead. I think if you'd have told me what I was doing now when I was 11 or when I was leaving primary school, I wouldn't have believed you, or probably even really known what it was. So I'd say that to my 11-year-old self, yeah, the job that you're going to do in the future, you probably don't even know that exists yet. So don't worry too much about it. Just do things that interest you and work hard.
I don't really know what I would say, but when I was 11, I guess I was just starting year 7, and I was an incredibly shy person, just incredibly shy. And to think I would, you know, one day in the future be happily chatting to people on Zoom, listened to by an audience of 80 or so, and being recorded, I could not have imagined something like that back then. So maybe I'd say to my 11-year-old self, it'll be all right. All of that stuff will find its place in the end.
Yeah, my 11-year-old self, I wouldn't be talking to her at all, because she was going to be a ballerina, the next Margot Fontaine. So I'd be waiting until I was 12 and at high school, and really the science was starting to, you know, take over the brain cells. And I would say, you know, back yourself. Don't assume that just big talkers out there know more than you do. And you've got this, you know, it will be great. That's what I'd tell myself.
I think I'd probably back everything Julia and Amy have said. Just if you like maths, keep going with it. You know, if you like long and dark pictures of planets, just keep looking at them. So yeah, you never know. Like, I think today's 11-year-olds could very well be have careers that involve them going to Titan. We just have no idea at this point. There are so many different ways that your life can go, and they're all completely okay, and many will be enjoyable for you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for your stories and for your insights today. Again, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to be able to ask you these questions and to have you sort of give us your time and your expertise. If anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about what our panelists do and some of the initiatives they're involved with, have a look on the website for this event. It does have bios available, and you will be able to sort of follow the breadcrumbs to kind of find out a little bit more about our panelists. And I look forward to further conversations in the next week for World Space Week. Thank you again, and over to you, Jess.
Thank you so much. So first of all, a huge thank you to all of you today. Suman, you did an incredible job moderating. Each and every one of you are so unique in your own way. And yeah, I've just learned so much. I could literally sit and listen to you guys for hours. I've got to say, Julia Dickinson, I'd love to have a look in your space scrapbook. That's such a great story. It's so important that we continue to have these conversations. And, as Amy kind of said, that we're transparent on challenges and share knowledge so that we can really move away from that 20% towards a more equal representation of women in the space industry. Again, I just want to say a huge thank you to our sponsor today, Lockheed Martin Australia, for your support. And the good news is the fun doesn't stop here. So as we said, we want to invite you all to attend our Australian Space Industry Technology, Infrastructure and Investment Festival of Space. And there's going to be a whole bunch of virtual events that will be running throughout November. So in the interim, to find out more on that, you can head to ASITII.space, and this will also get recorded and posted soon. So that's all from us today. Thanks, everyone. Have a really awesome day. And yeah, thanks again.